Hello, MOT2s. This is a recording related to productivity as part of the Practice Skills 4 course. And the focus will be on intervention planning. I'd like to start by talking about some general intervention strategies, then focus on some policies and legal issues that support some of our work, particularly related to return to work. And then we're going to conclude with some information related to episodic health conditions and how they might influence work. All of these topics are going to be further developed, and you're going to have a chance to use the material in our work in the lab coming up soon. So just by way of positioning us and summarizing where we are so far, we talked mostly so far about assessment and how we would try to capture and understand someone's journey related to work. And that might be with somebody that's just heading into the work world, and they might be developing through a high school or vocational program, and we might be working with them at the very beginning of their time of work. It could be that we're working with someone as they anticipate returning to work after there's been a gap. It could be that we're working with someone who's trying to stay at work. They haven't left work, but there's some challenge. Or it could be related to some other transitions that we'll continue to talk about throughout this course. So I would just say that in general, our job always as OTs is to understand the client's experience. And we do that in so many ways. Partly we do it as we do the clinical interview, as we connect with our client, learn from them what their experience has been. We also do physical testing, and we talked about, I tried to highlight that we would do that as occupational therapists to safely guide the functional testing that we would do next. And so if we're working independently, that would be definitely our role, to make sure that we're not, when we get to the point of functional testing, putting our clients at any risk. In addition to doing the functional testing that I've listed there, and as always, we're thinking broadly, we're thinking about physical, cognitive, and affective testing. There are a range of different ways that we would do that. Some of it is you've tried out using some pencil and paper tools. Some are standardized tests, so they're tests that we can compare our clients' scores to the scores of others that have done them. Some are non-standardized, but they're done in a standard way. And so there may be a particular way, for example, that lifting or carrying or pushing and pulling is evaluated so that it's safe, but also so that we're thoughtful about what information that we're gathering. We might be doing job simulation, understanding by simulating some activities that someone might need to be able to do in the workplace. If we break those activities down or simulate to the extent that we can in a clinic or non-workplace setting, we can test some things out there. And if possible, on the job assessment, which obviously has more of the context that's going to make sense to the client, and those cues can be really important. So that's the functional piece. But what I skipped over, and I'll go back to, is the client's perception of function. And so in part, we're going to understand that by doing the clinical interview. But as you know, there are also some tools that help us to capture that. And you tried out one recently, the spinal function sort, where folks are looking at pictures and trying to establish whether and communicate really whether they think that they're able to do that particular activity, and if so, would they be fully able to do it, or is there some variation there? And communicating and understanding that this full picture of a number of things on that screen is what we want to do by way of assessment. So that's sort of where we've come to so far. And I want us just to think and just be reminded about what our role is, which is similar to everything we do in occupational therapy for sure. It's determining if there's a fit. So when we think about PEO and think about how we might influence the person by helping them develop skills or confidence or capacity around particular things that they want to and need to do. That's part of our role. When we think about changing the environment to support our clients being successful in that work environment, certainly part of our role. When we consider fully the occupation and how it's typically done and how it is that we might adjust or promote adjustment to that occupation so it can be done more safely, or the portion that our client is able to safely do is what the main focus of the job is. That would be looking at the O piece. But ultimately, we're looking at those three elements and seeing if there's a fit. And if there is a fit, then our client is able to do that work, whether it be volunteer work or be working managing their home or work in competitive employment. That those are all examples of where there might be a good fit and someone's able to do productive portion of their life that's important to them. But if there's not a fit, then we call on our usual tricks, which is adapting the occupation, grading the occupation, adapting the environment, and also thinking about how we can help the client develop either capacity or confidence that I mentioned earlier, so that it's a better fit. So that's our overall principle. Now if we think about intervention strategies, I think it's important for you to have a bit of a sense of how that fits in terms of occupational therapy roles. And I think it's important to say that within productivity, there's at least a couple of different hats that an OT might wear. So one hat would be related to direct service provider. And so we may be the person making suggestions related to an educational program, or we might be working with the client as they integrate into a new job, or try to help them maintain their role at their current job. But all of that, where we're doing the hands-on connecting with the client and with the workplace and with the employer, that's direct service provision. And we do that related to productivity. We do that in many sectors. We do it within the education sector, within justice, sometimes being a part of supporting folks as they're leaving places where they might have, so an institution, for example, where they've maybe developed some work-related skills and then transitioning into the community. We do it related to health. And as I mentioned earlier, primary care is an area where occupational therapists are able to focus on productive activities under the health umbrella. We might be in the sector of social services as well. There's a lot of opportunity for occupational therapists, and some of that is direct service provision. But I also want to say, and we'll develop this a little bit further in another class that we do, is that sometimes occupational therapists aren't the ones providing the direct care and direct service, but rather working at a slightly different place where they're requesting the services maybe of an occupational therapist to provide the things that we're going to be talking about today. Case managers might work as independent consultants. They might be employed either at a particular workplace. Some large employers employ case managers, and they're often occupational therapists. And insurance companies also employ case managers that are occupational therapists that are well positioned to do that role. So I will say that most of what we'll do today in terms of the information I'm going to share with you is about how an occupational therapist would work in terms of direct service provision. But I think it's helpful to keep in the back of your mind that there are many other roles an OT might take on. So what do we know? If we kind of consolidate the work and thinking that's happened over many years related to people that have had a gap in their opportunity to do work, and particularly I'm thinking about competitive work in this slide. Here's what we know: that the longer someone is away from work, the likelihood of return to work goes down. It's directly proportional. And so what that tells us is timeliness and is really important. We know that when we have an opportunity to provide modified work, so if that's part of what we might offer up, and encourage a timely return to work. So again, it links to that first bullet for sure, that time is really important here. But oftentimes the return to work can be more likely influenced if it's returned to not full duties, but modified duties. That's how that point is a little distinctive. We know as OTs, this makes good sense to us, and the literature fleshes it out well, that client participation in the return to work process is very closely linked to success. We know that there are some bits of legislation and public policy that promote return to work, and that is significantly different in the last 2 decades, I'll say. And we also know that employers are not always able to manage modified return to work, and we'll talk about when that might be problematic. And with that in mind, we're going to try to be considering, as we think about work interventions, we're going to be thinking about interventions that would happen at the workplace. That's ideal when that can be the case, and interventions that happen away from the workplace, and that's necessary in some ways too. So one of the game changers, I'll say, in the last decade was this article. It was actually a systematic review of a fair bit of work that's been done related to return to work, and it really highlighted how work is beneficial to health. And that sounds like basic stuff to occupational therapists, but has been a little bit of a challenge in terms of helping some policymakers move to that understanding, and some workplaces as well. So this is just a wee summary of a systematic review that looked at the effect of returning to work on health. And so the reason that people were away from work in every one of these studies was because of the interruption related to health. Could be illness or could be injury. And so what happened when they looked at the group of studies that met the criteria is they were able to make a very significant link between how people's health improved as they returned to work. And so we know that work and health go together. In a way that makes sense, but I'll tell you why that has shifted our thinking a little bit. It used to be, and I'm thinking about back in the day when I first became involved in work as work-related rehab as a new graduate, I would say that the number one mantra that we were working with employers was that sure, they'd be happy to have their employee return to work as long as they could do 100%. That was often communicated, mostly just that clearly. It was the employer's prerogative to make a decision about when and if an employee could return to their workplace. And so as rehab professionals, I would say in the early days, for me, 35 years ago, we were working hard in clinics, in a variety of programs to try to get folks back to 100% so that then they could go back to work. And what I think is a really important shift is that now we understand that the goal of rehab is not to get people better to get back to work. That's a long-term goal, but rather our goal is to help people to get back to work in order to get better. And so that's a shift of thinking that links with some of the research that's shown that to be good practice, and also a shift in the way both rehab professionals are working, as well as how the legislation has changed to support people getting back to work in order to get better. So again, that our goal is not to help a client to get to 100% within a treatment setting. It's unlikely we would be able to do that because there are many things we can't actually simulate in a treatment setting. Sorry, I'm going to just put this down here. I'm afraid I might have been, anyway. Yeah, as I was saying, there are many things we can't simulate. So our goal is to help people get to a point that they can get to work and not put themselves at risk or put others at risk. But return to work is explored much earlier on, I would say now, than it ever used to be. So where does that happen? Where do these work-related services take place? Well, in some ways, it happens in the usual places. So healthcare facilities, and those might be facilities that are focused on physical health or mental health, or now in primary care facilities. They may be freestanding clinics, and that might be sometimes affiliated with a hospital, as Wellness Institute, for example, is affiliated with Seven Oaks Hospital, or it could be a clinic that's entirely separate from a hospital, entirely private. Return to work and work-related OT services happen in the workplace. Happily, that's a really ideal when that can be so. It happens within community agencies such as social services. It happens in schools, and it happens in our clients' homes if we're working with clients to support them getting ready to be a volunteer, for example. We're starting to do those interventions in the place that's most comfortable for them. Okay, so let's talk about work hardening programs. This is just a consolidation of a slide that we've captured and talked about this information before, because I wanted you to have it before our last lab. So remember that work hardening is the most specific sort of treatment. It is multidisciplinary by definition. It is a combination of work tasks and conditioning tasks. It's very structured in terms of people come in and usually have their time card. They record when they come in, when they leave, and they work through their program often once it's set up fairly independently, so that they can start to develop that sense of agency and confidence. And that goal, as I've mentioned earlier, is really to help folks transition from being a patient, someone separated from their work for a variety of reasons, to being a worker. But that's just one program that's possible. There are many others, and they're called many things. And so this can be kind of confusing. So it's always best when people say, well, I'm in a work conditioning program, or as an occupational therapist working in a work conditioning program, we'd want to say, what does that mean? And listen for how that's different or the same as work hardening. Sometimes work conditioning program is offered when it's only one discipline, because work hardening by definition has to be multidisciplinary. And so if people are starting to work on work-related tasks with an occupational therapist, that might be called work conditioning. But people get ready to go back to work in a variety of using a variety of approaches, including strengthening, functional, so when they start to do things that are like work or can simulate some portion of their work, and that might be called work conditioning. It may be a gradual return to work that's part of the intervention program. It could be related to the supports that are at the workplace, so job coaching or supportive employment, where there's an environment set up that is likely to support success, or it could be vocational training. And that might be what's happening in a school, for example. So there are lots of ways and approaches to programming related to work intervention. So I'm just going to throw those at you, and beyond this, we're going to just define it when we use it, because it's too confusing otherwise. So what I've talked about so far are primarily things that happen away from work to help people get into work for the first time, or to get back to the work if they've been interrupted. But I'm going to shift gears now and speak for a few moments about working on work goals at work. So I want to presume that some of what we might do would be away from the workplace. As occupational therapists, we would see some value in some of the things that we some of the ways we would want to connect with our client before we're connecting with them at work. But connecting them with them at work is where we want to go. We want them to, just as that Judy Village quote suggested, our role as folks interested in supporting work is to get people back to work in whatever capacity is safe, and then help them incrementally do what they want to do and need to do. So work at work is where we want to go. So in order to do that, I think it's important for us to think about job accommodation. And we talked a little bit about this in first year. So I'm going to ask you to dust off those cobwebs for just a moment. And when I'm talking about work accommodations, it could be related to the work environment, or the tasks, or the schedule that people are working on. It could be a range of different things that adjust in some way, the O or the E, part of the way that we think about PEO, in order for a client to be more likely to be successful in that work that they're doing. And so typically we would go back to the job demands analysis and figure out, okay, of the way the job is typically done, what are the most essential components of the job, and how can we adjust job expectations or the environment in which people are doing their work in a way that would be reasonable. And so those are called reasonable accommodations. And that's actually a legal term. Reasonable accommodations has been highlighted in a variety of different pieces of legislation. So within our Human Rights Act, so the Canadian one, and the Charter, the Canadian Charter. And then if we look more locally, we have the Manitoba Human Rights Code, and reasonable accommodation fits into there. And then I'm going a little bit even I'm less broad and getting right down into the nitty gritty. Then we have some policies that are written for particular parts of the work experience. And so, for example, workplace safety and health regulations are written to talk about how people can and should be supported to do things at work that might cause musculoskeletal strain. And then Workers' Compensation Board has a particular policy related to what employers are required to do to re-employ workers. So reasonable accommodation is a legal thing, and there are legal elements and policy elements that help to put it into practice. So if we just briefly think about what we know about the Manitoba Human Rights Code, there are a number of discrimination points that we that employers are not allowed to consider. And so we cannot discriminate against ancestry, nationality, ethnic background, and you can see the list continues to go. What I'm going to focus on here is physical and mental disability. So employers legally are not allowed to discriminate because someone is unable to do their job related to mental or physical disability. So sounds good in the biggest picture, tricky to put into action, but it's the overarching important component that we think about. So back to this idea of duty to accommodate, and particularly within the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Here's how it's stated: the obligation of an employer or union to take appropriate steps to eliminate disadvantage. So that's the main thing, that we're trying to make sure that employees are not disadvantaged. To employees or prospective employees resulting from a rule or a practice or a physical barrier that may have an adverse impact. So that's the way human rights, the Canadian Human Rights Commission has described duty to accommodate. So what that looks like is probably important for us to think about. So employers, we want to think about it from their shoes. How far must they go in considering this duty to accommodate? So first of all, an employer has to be very explicit about whether the person can do the job as it exists. So that's where our responsibility and opportunity to do job demands analysis really helps to support people understanding this well. So that would be the first step. If based on a JDA that identifies all of these things are typically part of doing the job, then the creative part comes into account, where employers are challenged to think, well, if the person can't do everything on this JDA, how could it be changed? How could it be rebundled? Or could someone have some retraining and be able to do some other elements of another job so that their work is purposeful and supportive of the employer's goals, but maybe not just exactly the way a job has always been described. And so this is where employers are required to kind of look around and see what's possible for the employees that they work with. So they're not required to generate a job that wouldn't be helpful for their goals or not really productive at all. And we can probably imagine that wouldn't be helpful for clients as they would consider doing this job either. Everybody wants to have meaningful work. Employers are not required to eliminate any function of the job or lower the standard or put folks on permanent modified duties or create a new job. So there are kind of some parameters around requirements, but the most important one, and the one that we end up debating and scratching our head around most often, is this idea of the last bullet on the screen, which is employers aren't required to offer accommodation to the extent that it's going to cause them undue hardship. Again, a legal term. Here's what the legal term relates to. Basically, the cost. If we asked an employer to change the work or the work environment to the extent that the employer would be in some way at risk financially, then that would not be expected. So if we were asking someone to totally renovate a work environment, if it's a small organization and that would put them at risk to make those kind of renovations, that actually would be considered undue hardship. If the accommodation would create a safety or health risk to either the person that we're suggesting it for or to someone else, that would also be considered undue hardship. So in general, as occupational therapists, as we're thinking broadly, we're trying to imagine what's going to work best for our client, for the folks that our client works with. So those are the others. And we would want things to be safe and work well for those folks. And then we would also, when another stakeholder is certainly the employer, and we would need to be making recommendations that fit that whole realm of undue hardship. And it's not clear cut. And so this is where a fair bit of conversation tends to happen. I just wanted, and so going from that big picture of undue hardship to a smaller policy, but a very important one, and not that old really. Workers' Compensation Board has used the has introduced some time ago the obligation to reemploy policy, and that means that if claimants are off work because of something that's happened in their workplace and that claim is accepted, then within certain, again, there are certain boundaries and parameters for the policy, but overall, I'll say big picture, Workers' Compensation Board has a responsibility, a commitment to help that person, that claimant, become reemployed. And so it's trying to take away some of the potential for folks to fall through the cracks if they're unable to resume work at 100%, which, as I say, is we're trying to put that kind of thinking in the past. So the way that has worked itself through in terms of legislation is Workers' Compensation Board is able to say to employers, it's your duty to reemploy because this injury happened and was accepted as an insurance company. We've accepted the claim. As an employer, you have a responsibility part of that responsibility is related to obligation to reemploy. So I'll leave it at that, but that's something you'll be exploring a bit further when you start on the thinking about the return to work assignment. And finally, I did want to mention the influence of episodic health conditions on work. So just a little bit of background that I'll share with you, but we'll put this, we'll think about this more when we have our lab together soon. So episodic health conditions are conditions such as the ones that I've provided as examples here: diabetes, HIV/AIDS, Crohn's, colitis, Hep C, chronic fatigue, migraines, depression, anxiety, multiple sclerosis. So that's not exhaustive, but I'm wanting you to start to think about what do those health conditions, what's similar about those health conditions. There's obviously there's a lot of ways that they're very different, but what I want us to focus on as we consider this particular collection is that symptoms come and go. That's an important feature. And there's unpredictable in terms of intensity and duration. And so that's an important feature as well. So when someone lives with an episodic health condition, conditions that come and go and that are unpredictable, we can imagine that that's challenging related to productivity, and it's challenging related to maybe getting into the workplace, and sometimes it's challenging as the symptoms change in terms of staying in the workplace. And so occupational therapists are certainly involved in doing some thinking about, well, what accommodations are relevant and required for folks that live with episodic health conditions. And so we would want to be doing some thinking and brainstorming related to that. And I think very importantly, and often comes up in a range of work-related interventions, is disclosure, how much information the employer should have and how comfortable the client is in terms of sharing their information. So first, I'll say that in general, employers' opportunity to know information is limited. Employers need to know what someone's functional capacity is, but they're not required to know their health condition. And so that's an important thing for us to think about, and help our clients think about that too. It also has some distinct, and that's distinctly important as we think about consent and when we're giving and sharing information. And so we would want to be really clear with our clients in terms of gathering information, who we would share it with. So in our work as health professionals, we would share work and our findings to the health team, but we would be very thoughtful about sharing our findings with the employment team. It's not that we wouldn't, but our findings would not be related to the health status. They would be related to the functional status. And that's an important distinction. So I'll leave it at that. I'm going to give you something to look at further related, but that's something that we'll talk about in our lab next. Just wanted to highlight for you an organization that I hope that you find helpful. It's called the Institute for Work and Health. It's in Ontario. It's, well, because it's Canadian, it's really helpful. I think as a service provider, I'm there. I follow them. They drop things into my inbox as new things come out. And what I'll say they do primarily is consolidate research that's out there. So they are really add a lot to the literature related to systematic reviews. They do a lot of work in that regard. So they're not doing the primary research, but they're pulling it together in really important ways. Their primary goal actually is knowledge translation. So what a gift that they can take so much and distill it down. So I tell you that because I think even if this area of practice isn't what you're thinking, so much of what they offer is I think you'll find quite broad and helpful. So yeah, just a nudge. Got some references here, and I look forward to seeing you soon.